Welcome, everyone. So glad you're here. I am Linda Sunnan, the manager of public programs here at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, the board of directors, our staff and volunteer, welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. Many of you were at last week's program on Churchill's life and legacy. We are delighted that you have decided to join us again today. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are so glad you're here. Today's session on Sir Winston Churchill and the Jews is part of the museum's Liberation 2020 series, Voices of the Liberator, the Liberated, and the Lost. It's a series dedicated to reflecting on the legacy of the Holocaust and of World War II. I would like to thank all of our Liberation 2020 partners listed on our opening slides for their continued support. Now it's my honor to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Lee Pollock. Lee is an acclaimed writer and speaker on the life and times of Sir Winston Churchill. He is a trustee and advisor to the board of the International Churchill Society and previously served as its executive director. Lee holds a BA from McGill University, a master's degree from the University of Chicago, and is a fellow at the National Churchill Museum. He has written about Churchill for leading publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New Criterion, and the Daily Beast, and has appeared on CBS, the BBC, and other media outlets. He has also been a featured speaker at museums, universities, religious institutions, and private clubs throughout the United States and Canada. Lee, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you, Linda. It's my pleasure to be here.
I understand you brought a guest with today.
Yes, my friend Sir Winston, he decided to join us. This is actually my favorite bust of Churchill. It's by the great British sculptor Oscar Nehmen, who actually was a Jewish refugee from pre-war Europe. Some years ago, we donated a larger than life-size bust of Churchill to the US Capitol Art Collection, and it was modeled on this image. So if Churchill cannot be here in reality, at least he can be here in spirit.
Very nice. Before we dive into today's topic, can you tell us a little bit about you and the International Churchill Society, your interest in Winston Churchill in general, and then what drew you to specifically focus on Churchill and the Jews?
Sure. First of all, thank you to the Illinois Holocaust Museum for creating this program. I've been a friend and supporter of the museum since you opened your wonderful building in Skokie, I think now more than 10 years ago. And in this challenging era of world history, the themes that your museum epitomizes, tolerance, learning, education, the importance of history, are more important than ever. So hopefully everyone who's watching today is a member and supporter of yours, and if not, they should be. So that's my tip of the hat to the Illinois Holocaust Museum.
Thank you for that.
The International Churchill Society is a worldwide member organization of people interested in Churchill's historic life and legacy, and in making that relevant for today and for future generations. We do that in a whole wide variety of ways. We have the premier website about everything to do with Churchill's life, winstonchurchill.org. We publish the only magazine devoted to Churchill exclusively. It's called Finest Hour. We have an email list of over 50,000 people around the world. We have the premier annual Churchill conference held around the United States or in England. We created a wonderful Churchill Library and Research Center at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Do a lot of educational programs with college students, provide travel and research grants for students of history to go to England. And one thing I'm particularly proud of, for the last number of years, every November, we've sponsored a Winston Churchill birthday toast and reception in partnership with the Speaker of the House of Representatives. It was Speaker Pelosi. It's bipartisan, as few things seem to be in Washington these days, so it's something that we're very proud of. As far as my own interest in Churchill and why Churchill and the Jews is a fascinating subject, there's probably no more interesting a figure in modern history than Winston Churchill. From his first election to Parliament in 1900 until the time he retired as Prime Minister for the last time in 1955, he was a dominant figure on the world stage, influencing and being part of almost every event in that very tumultuous half century. Just think of everything that happened in those 50 years. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the atomic age, the rise of communism, the Cold War. It was everything you could possibly pack into a short 50 years, and Churchill was involved in all of it. He's a fascinating figure as an individual. He was a writer, politician, statesman, bricklayer, artist, lots and lots of things. And as far as the Jewish connection is concerned, the Jewish people have obviously been a small minority in world history, but I think our impact and influence has far, far dwarfed those numbers. I would argue that the history of the Jews can be a mirror for the broader Gentile world. Churchill himself quoted the 19th century British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who was born Jewish but converted to the Church of England, who famously said, "The Lord deals with the nations as the nations deal with the Jews." A lot of our information about Winston Churchill comes from a great historian, the late Sir Martin Gilbert. And I think many of our viewers today have probably read some of Martin's enormous biography of Sir Winston Churchill. Martin was a committed Jew and a Zionist, wrote extensively not only about Churchill, but about the Holocaust, Israel, and almost everything else of importance in the 20th century. Martin liked to tell a story of how he happened to become particularly interested in the subject. It was in the fall of 1969. Martin was a young historian working on the Churchill biography, and he spent the day with General Sir Louis Spears, a man then well in his 80s. Spears had been a longtime friend of Churchill's, and like Churchill, a distinguished historian, parliamentarian, soldier, but definitely not a Zionist. By the end of the day, it seemed that Spears had taken a liking to his young guests, being convinced that Martin would present Churchill faithfully, warts and all. And as Martin related the story, towards the end of the day, Spears leaned over and said, "You know, Gilbert, even Winston had a fault." Martin says he perked up his ears, expecting some deep revelation about Churchill's character, and Spears drew closer and whispered in his ear, "Winston was too fond of the Jews." And I would argue that that so-called fault was in fact a great virtue of a great man, which is hopefully what we'll be able to demonstrate today. I think this talk is of interest, obviously, to Jewish people, and the subject is, but if I can paraphrase that old rye bread commercial from years ago, you don't have to be Jewish to enjoy this subject.
Oh, what a lovely background there. So to begin, though, help us with a little bit of context about Churchill's life. What was the situation of the Jews in England when Churchill was growing up? And was there anything in his background or upbringing that might have made him more favorably disposed to Jews and to Zionism?
Yes. Churchill was born in 1874 into the highest ranks of the British aristocracy. He was born at the famous Blenheim Palace. His grandfather was the Duke of Marlborough. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had just been elected to Parliament and was a rising star in British politics. Some people thought a future prime minister. At this point, this was the high point of the great British Empire. Britannia truly ruled the waves, and the sun never set on the British Empire. The Jewish community in Britain had been in existence for some 1,000 years, but with a lot of ups and downs, expelled during the Middle Ages, brought back to England during the reign of Oliver Cromwell. By the time of Churchill's birth, the Jewish community was about 40,000, so a very small minority in a nation of some 20 million people. And in fact, it was only 16 years before Churchill's birth, that is in 1858, that the first Jew was allowed to sit in the House of Commons, fittingly one of the Rothschild family. He was allowed to take the oath of office, not with the usual words, "on the true faith of a Christian." Instead, he substituted, "So help me Jehovah." Despite that fact, anti-Semitism was widespread in Britain at the time. It was more religious, not the racial anti-Semitism that grew in Europe later in the 19th century and increasingly in the 20th century. So thus it was that Benjamin Disraeli could be a celebrated British conservative prime minister, even though he had been born a Jew and did not convert to Christianity until later in life. So Winston's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had close relationships with a number of prominent Jewish people. Sir Ernest Cassell, who was one of the leading financiers of the day, and a friend of the Prince of Wales, a man named Baron Maurice de Hirsch. And Randolph Churchill's father would invite these Jews to his home, and in fact was criticized by some of his family and his friends for doing that. There's a famous story when Randolph went to stay at the country house of one of his aristocratic friends, and the friend asked him sarcastically, "What, Randolph, you haven't brought any of your Jewish friends?" And Lord Randolph replied sarcastically, "No, I did not think they would be amused by your company."
Okay, well, this next question has two parts to it. First, can you share with us some of the career high points and low points Churchill experienced from the time he was elected to Parliament, as you said, in 1900, at the tender age of 24, to becoming one of the most important figures in Britain by the time of the First World War? And the follow-up, and I'll just put them together for you, is if you would highlight both the relationships he was able to develop with Jewish groups and individuals during that same period, as well as the role he played as it affected Jewish interests in general, and the Balfour Declaration and the status of Palestine in particular.
Well, that's a boatload of good questions. Churchill maintained the friendships that his father had developed with prominent Jews, and they looked after him after his father died when Winston was only 20. As you mentioned, by 1900, Churchill had been elected to the House of Commons at the age of only 24. He immediately was a rising star in the political scene. He began as a traditional conservative, but in 1904, defected, crossed the floor of the House of Commons, and became a member of the Liberal Party. And this was quite shocking to his family and most of his friends and acquaintances. 2 years later, he was elected to the House of Commons in a different constituency in Manchester, and a third of the population in that constituency were Jews. And that was really the first practical connection Churchill had with Jewish interests and Jewish causes. By this point, the Jewish community in England had changed dramatically. It had risen from only 40,000 to approximately 200,000. These Jews were different than the Jews of the mid-19th century. They were poor, Yiddish-speaking, much less assimilated, and they tended to cluster in the East End of London and in other cities. In fact, while he was in Manchester, Churchill made his first acquaintance, a brilliant young chemist teaching at the University of Manchester. 43 years later, that man would become the first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann. Churchill's appreciation of the Jewish cause was evident early on. He said at this time, quote, "I am in full sympathy with the historical aspirations of the Jews. The restoration to them of a center of racial and political integrity would be a tremendous event in the history of the world." And Churchill rose rapidly in government. He entered the cabinet in 1908. He was Home Secretary 2 years later. And then in 1911, at the age of only 37, he became First Lord of the Admiralty. The British Navy was the principal line of defense for Britain and its global empire. His career, as it turned out, took a downturn shortly after the war began. In 1915, there was a spectacularly unsuccessful British expedition in the Gallipoli Peninsula and the Dardanelles Straits of Turkey, designed to knock Turkey out of the war. Turkey had been an ally of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria. It was a spectacular failure with hundreds of thousands of casualties. It wasn't entirely Churchill's fault or his conception. It was an exercise that might have succeeded, but he took the blame for it. He was pushed out of government altogether and actually went to serve on the front lines in Belgium for about a year and a half. He thought his career was over at age 40. His wife, Clementine, famously said, "I thought he would die of grief." And that's actually when Churchill took up painting for the first time as a solace for what he thought had been a career-ending failure. Of course, his career wasn't over. He returned to the government in July 1917 as Minister of Munitions. A few months later, in November, the famous Ballard Declaration appeared. As many of you and our viewers, I think, know, that was not a long document. Essentially, it was a few short paragraphs in the form of a letter from Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary to Lord Rothschild. And the central paragraph said that the British government was in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, but nothing shall be done which may prejudice the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. And that was the rub, I think, for much of the history of the Middle East in the ensuing decades, even up to today, how to reconcile those conflicting interests. One reason the British government adopted the Balfour Declaration, in addition to a general sense of Christian Zionism, was it was felt that it would help keep Russia in the First World War on the Allied side, and also influence prominent American Jews who might be more favorable to the Allied cause because of that. America had just entered the war a few months before. Churchill was in government. He wasn't centrally involved in the crafting of the Balfour Declaration, but was clearly sympathetic to its aims, as he'd been connected with the idea of a national home for the Jewish people going back almost 2 decades before.
I'd like to probe a little deeper on that idea of Churchill's efforts to help establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. What was Churchill's role? What did he play in the League of Nations awarding a mandate for Palestine to Britain after the war? And as a follow-up, please talk about Churchill's views on Zionism, his visit to Palestine in the early 1920s, and his role in Palestine's development under British rule throughout the 1930s.
Sure. As the First World War drew to a close, the Ottoman Empire, which had controlled most of the Middle East, was rapidly disintegrating. The British Army entered Jerusalem late in 1917. General Allenby famously got off his horse and decided to walk through one of the gates into the Holy City. So the question then became, as the war came to an end and the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating, what would be done with all its various possessions? It included Iraq, much of Saudi Arabia, but became Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. Churchill actually originally opposed the granting of a League of Nations mandate to Britain to administer Palestine. He thought it would be troublesome and expensive, which it actually turned out to be. But he couldn't get away from the issue. In February 1921, he became the colonial secretary with responsibility directly for this issue. There was a famous conference in Cairo in March 1921, in which the British and French divided up the map of the Middle East. Churchill made it his business to create new kingdoms. As he put it, he put Faisal on the throne of the new kingdom of Iraq and Abdullah on the new throne of what became known as Transjordan. The lands of Palestine west of the River Jordan became the new mandate. Churchill, after the Cairo conference, being a man of action, decided to go see things on the ground in Palestine for himself. So off he went with his military advisor, a shrewd British Middle East expert named T.E. Lawrence, better known today as Lawrence of Arabia, and Sir Herbert Samuel, who was appointed the first British commissioner of Palestine. Samuel was proud of both of being British and as well as being a Jew. On that visit, Churchill visited Mount Scopus, the future site of the Hebrew University, planted a tree. He met with both the Jewish residents and the Congress of Palestinian Arabs. The Arabs were vehemently opposed to Jewish settlement in Palestine, even as it was, let alone any potential increase. They provided Churchill with a 35-page memorandum, which included this statement, quote, "The Jew is clannish and unneighborly. He will enjoy the privileges and benefits of a country, but will give nothing in return." And that is certainly a trope of classic anti-Semitism. But Churchill and the British government persevered and established a policy that provided for British rule of Palestine with Jewish immigration permitted subject to the economic capacity. This was all put together in a white paper in March 1922, and it was Churchill's job to steer that through Parliament. The plan was actually defeated in the House of Lords, and when it came to the House of Commons afterwards, Churchill roundly supported it, made an impassioned speech indicating that the Jews of Palestine should not be left to be attacked by Arabs, and supporting the idea of a mandate that, in Churchill's mind, would benefit both peoples. So that was the establishment of the British mandate in Palestine, but the seeds of trouble were sown pretty much from the start. In 1922, Churchill lost office when the Conservative government was defeated. He returned to power, when the Liberal government was defeated. He returned to power 2 years later, this time as a Conservative, because the Liberal Party had been reduced to pretty much second-rate status. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer for 5 years, from the equivalent of Secretary of the Treasury here, for 5 years from 1924 to 1929. He was not directly involved with British government policy in Palestine during that time, but he remained sympathetic to the Jewish cause and to settlement of further Jewish immigrants in the area. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the Jewish population of Palestine continued to grow. By 1929, there were over 150,000 Jews, but the Arab population had grown as well. A few years later, the Jewish population was almost 400,000, but the Arab population was 1.3 million. There was an uprising in the Arab parts of Palestine in 1929. So this issue continued to bedevil the British government: how to administer this territory economically, how to reconcile the conflicting interests of Jews and Arabs. By the 1930s, Churchill was out of office. The Conservative government had been defeated in 1929, and he wasn't to return to any political power until 10 years later. In 1937, there was a British government commission known as the Peel Commission, which recommended partition of Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab. Churchill opposed the partition, and the idea was dropped, but there were limitations on Jewish immigration put in place at that time. In 1937, Neville Chamberlain became prime minister, and he was more favorably disposed than Churchill by far to the Arab cause as opposed to the Jewish cause. There was another British government peace conference in January of 1939 at which the interests of the Arabs and the Jews could not be reconciled. The Arab delegation, in fact, when it got to London, refused to sit in the same room as the Jewish delegation. So there was no prospect of any kind of harmonious settlement. Chamberlain, meantime, tilted the British policy towards the Arabs. He wanted to preserve the goodwill of what he vaguely thought of as the Arab world. He said at one point to his cabinet, quote, "If we must offend one side, let us offend the Jews, not the Arabs." More privately, he wrote a letter to his sister Hilda in which he said, quote, and this is referencing the increasing Nazi persecution of Jews in Germany. He said, "No doubt the Jews aren't a lovable people, and I don't care about them myself, but that is not an excuse for a pogrom." So all this time, Winston Churchill was on the backbench, as it became known as his wilderness years from 1929 to 1939.
I'd like to stay in your last sentence. You brought us to Germany, and I'd like to dig in there for a moment now. As we all know, Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, at which point persecution of the Jews began in earnest. Tell us about Churchill's opposition to Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and did he ever meet Hitler?
Well, in the 1920s, the Nazis were regarded as a fringe movement in Weimar Germany. Adolf Hitler, with his toothbrush mustache, was more a figure of ridicule than someone to be taken seriously. In the Reichstag election in 1928, the Nazis received only 2.6% of the vote. But that changed very dramatically after the beginning of the Great Depression. And in the election of September 1930, they rocketed up to 19% of the vote in a multi-party system. They were the second largest political party in the country after the Social Democrats. British newspapers were filled with headlines about the fascist rising and the fascist success in Germany. Interestingly, only a month later, in October 1930, Churchill, who was a backbencher at the time, not in government, went to a dinner at the German embassy in London, and there he met the German political counselor, who happens to have been Bismarck's grandson, and asked him numerous questions about the Nazis. And as Bismarck reported back to Berlin, quote, Churchill was convinced that Hitler would seize the first available opportunity to resort to armed force. And this was a time in which few, if any, people in the Western world, including Britain, had taken much notice of Hitler, let alone been able to anticipate what he would do. And the report back to Berlin continued, quote, Churchill's remarks deserve particular attention. He will play an influential role in any conservative government in years to come. And that was certainly a prophecy that would become true. 2 years later, in July 1932, the Nazis were the largest party in Germany with 37% of the vote. It was clear that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were a menace to be reckoned with. And as to your question about Churchill meeting Hitler, that is one of the great what-if stories of history. During the 1930s, when Churchill was out of office, he did not have the salary of a government minister. And to be honest, he enjoyed living well. He had a large home with a large staff, and the bills for food and cigars and champagne were considerable. So he depended on writing to make a living. He was one of the highest paid journalists in the 1930s in both the United States and in Britain. But he also wanted to write serious history, and he took upon himself to write what became an epic 4-volume biography of his great ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, who had defeated the continental aggressor of that day, Louis XIV, at the Battle of Blenheim in Bavaria. So as part of his research for this, in the summer of 1932, Churchill and a small group of people, including his then 21-year-old journalist son Randolph, set off to do research in Bavaria. As it turned out, Randolph, as part of his burgeoning journalistic career, had become friendly with Hitler's foreign press aide, a sophisticated man who had actually gone to Harvard named Ernst Hofstengel. His nickname was Putzi. Putzi and Randolph got together and suggested that Churchill and Hitler meet. Hofstengel said that would be easy to arrange because Hitler regularly came to have tea at the same hotel at which the Churchill party was staying. Churchill agreed to the meeting, but beforehand, he had dinner with Hofstengel. Hofstengel defended Hitler's anti-Semitism by attributing it to merely a concern about the influx of foreign Jews from Eastern Europe into Germany and the fact that Jews were overrepresented in German professions. So he downplayed it as much as he could. But Churchill, I think, saw through this and would have none of it. He said to Hofstengel, tell your boss for me that anti-Semitism may be a good starter, but it is a bad sticker. And then Churchill continued, why is Hitler so violent about the Jews? What is the sense of being against a man simply because of his birth? Hofstengel reported this back to Hitler, and then the next day had to come back to Randolph and Winston and explain that the meeting was canceled because Hitler would not be coming to the hotel that day. Churchill recorded that he stayed in Munich for several more days, but Hitler never appeared. Years later, Churchill's grandson, also named Winston Churchill, said to me that he felt that Hitler was simply afraid to meet Churchill, even though Churchill was out of power, and that he must have subconsciously at least recognized that Winston Churchill would become his great nemesis, which was actually the case. 6 months later, January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany and turned it into a military power, the likes of which the world had never seen. As the 1930s continued on, Churchill became an outspoken opponent of Nazi Germany. He was head of the Anti-Nazi League, continued to speak and write in opposition to Hitler's regime, in particular its anti-Semitism, and then most famously condemned the Munich Agreement in 1937, under which the British government attempted to appease the Nazis by giving them part of Czechoslovakia. But Churchill was out of power and his influence was limited. He was very unpopular with wide segments of the Conservative Party. And throughout this time, the restrictions of the 1937 White Paper and then the one in 1939 that followed it remained in place. The wheel of history turned, the Second World War began. Churchill returned to government in September 1939 as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position he had held at the start of the First War against Germany 25 years before. A few months later, May 10th, 1940, the Nazis invade Belgium, Holland, and France, and the war begins in earnest. Winston Churchill on that day becomes prime minister in what will soon be a very dark time for Britain and the free world. There's an anecdote recorded many years later by a man named Ben Gale, who had been a young Palestinian Jew on that day, May 10th, 1940. He was attending a lecture in Tel Aviv, and as he reports it, the speaker was handed a note, which he then read aloud, that said, "Winston Churchill is now prime minister." Gale reported that everyone in the room stood up and cheered wildly. This was a message of hope for the Jews of Palestine who were to be saved, but not for the Jews of Europe who were not.
Let's turn specifically to the Holocaust. What did Churchill and the British government know? When did they know it? And how did they respond?
Okay, well, of any question we want to talk about today, that's the biggest to unwrap, the most challenging and complicated. So I'll touch on some of the highlights and express some of my thoughts. Questions about the history of the Holocaust are invariably controversial and interesting, and I'll certainly look forward to the thoughts that people have during the question and answer period. The Holocaust began in earnest, as I look at it, on June 22nd, 1941, with the the German invasion of Russia. There were mobile killing squads known as Einsatzgruppen who followed the Wehrmacht into Russia. And in the course of barely a few months, they killed approximately 1.5 million people. It was known as the Holocaust by bullets. It's much less well known to people today than the Holocaust that we know of through the extermination camps. But it was devastating to the people of the eastern half of Poland and of Russia, the areas that the Germans conquered. All along a while, the Germans concentrated Jews in ghettos in the former parts of Poland, the Lodz Ghetto, Warsaw, places that most of you, I think, know very much about. As to when and how the Allies and Churchill heard about what was happening in Germany, news filtered out, but it was a sort of disjointed process. Some of the original reports of what was happening in Russia came from interceptions of German military radio transmissions that were being listened to by the British, the famous Enigma machine that you know about. And there were also reports from the Polish government in exile in London. But there was confusion as to what was happening. It was clear that terrible things were happening to the Jews of Europe, but to some extent, the world put that in the context of terrible things are happening to many people, to the people of Russia, the occupied countries of Europe. Specifically referenced the persecution of Jews, and he said, quote, "We're in the presence of a crime without a name." And of course, that crime later acquired the name of the Holocaust. I think the policy of the British government and Churchill was that the best way to help the persecuted Jews of Europe was by defeating Adolf Hitler. And that was certainly true to some degree. If Hitler had conquered the Soviet Union, or if Ernst Rommel's Afrika Korps had been able to proceed through Egypt into Palestine, many more Jews would have been killed. But while this was happening, the British White Paper remained in effect, prohibiting or severely limiting Jewish refugees, the few who could escape from Nazi Europe, from coming to Palestine. Most politicians, other than Churchill, and most members of the higher levels of the armed forces and the civil service were concerned about goodwill in the Arab world. And there was not a small current of anti-Semitism involved in that. Anthony Eden was the foreign secretary during this time, and one of his associates recorded him saying the following quote, "Anthony is immovable on the subject of Palestine. He loves Arabs and hates Jews." Whether that was truly the case or not, it can be debated, but it was symptomatic of an attitude on the part of the highest levels in Britain, other than Churchill, that the plight of the Jews was merely one terrible thing that was happening in a terrible war, not something that could be singled out by itself. So you can ask the question, well, why didn't Churchill take care of this himself? He was the prime minister. And the reality, unfortunately, was that, as relates to this issue, that he was not a dictator. He was the head of a coalition democratic government. And in the war cabinet, the broader cabinet, and in the conservative Labor parties, there was a relative lack of interest in focusing too heavily on the plight of the Jewish people. And there were lots of explanations and excuses for that, that if too much emphasis was placed on the suffering of the Jews, the Nazis would use that as propaganda to say that the Allies were fighting the war on behalf of the Jews. So in 1942, there was a note in the cabinet minutes as it related to Palestine that said, quote, "All practicable steps should be taken to discourage illegal immigration into Palestine." Churchill did not agree with this, but he did not make it a major cause, even if he had been able to do that. And I think the sad reality is, even if the gates to Palestine had been opened wider in 1942 and 1943, I think the reality is that some Jews would have been saved, but not the millions who were to perish in the Holocaust. The Jews who died at the hands of the Einsatzgruppen in 1941 and 1942 were far beyond the reach of Allied forces. The death camps of Operation Reinhard, Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, which operated in 1942 and early 1943, were 1,000 miles inside occupied Europe, well beyond the range of Allied bombers, even if they had known, even if the Allies had truly understood what was happening there. There were increasing reports in 1943 and 1944 from a variety of sources that provided more detail as to what was happening in Eastern Europe. Some of these, again, came from the Polish government in exile. Some came from courageous prisoners who had actually escaped from Auschwitz. The most famous report was prepared by two escapees from Auschwitz, Rudolf Verba and his colleague Wetzler. They prepared a report late in April detailing in considerable extent what actually was happening at Auschwitz. The irony is that in April and May, when this report was being prepared and circulated to a wide number of people, the Germans invaded Hungary, and the SS killing machine that was commanded personally by Adolf Eichmann swept into the Hungarian countryside. And in a matter of literally just 8 weeks, 437,000 Jews from the Hungarian countryside outside of Budapest were taken to Auschwitz. 90% of them were exterminated on arrival. The news of the Verba-Wetzler report finally reached the highest levels in London. On July 6, 1944, Chaim Weizmann, on behalf of the Jewish Agency, met with Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, and asked that the railroad lines to Auschwitz and the camp itself be bombed. Eden referred this request to Churchill, who replied in writing, quote, "Get anything out of the Air Force you can and invoke me if necessary." Ironically, the deportations from Hungary stopped just 2 days later. But notwithstanding Churchill's urging, as we all know, the rail lines and the camp itself were not bombed. The request was referred to the 15th Army Air Corps of the United States unit that was based in northern Italy that was within flying range of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The story of what happened to that request and why it was never acted on is a long, long, complicated subject. In my mind, it was a combination of a number of things. The resistance was based on the fact that this was not a strictly military target, a fear that the bombing would actually kill the prisoners and provide more fuel for Nazi propaganda. But there was also an inertia and lack of concern. Ironically, in June 1944, when this request first began to circulate, the Jewish Agency was initially opposed to it on the grounds that it would kill Jewish prisoners. And even the Jewish Agency thought that Auschwitz-Birkenau was as much a labor camp as an extermination camp. They changed their mind by July, and then by that point, the deportations from Hungary had stopped. And to me, Auschwitz becomes the great moral symbol of the failing of the Allied governments, both Britain and America, to truly understand and appreciate the Holocaust, and particularly what was happening at Auschwitz itself. It's a long, complicated subject, and I'm sure we could have multiple hours of conversation just about that.
Well, we do want to give an opportunity for those who are with us today to ask questions, and I'm sure that someone will circle back to that. But my last question for you this afternoon, is as the Second World War came to a close, how did British policy in Palestine evolve, and what was Churchill's role in that?
The British policy was ambivalent as the war came to a close. The Balfour Declaration supporting a home for the Jewish people was never revoked or rejected, but at the same time, there was no big push as the war ended to make Palestine truly a Jewish home. In May and June 1945, as the war was coming to an end in Europe, there was an exchange of correspondence between Churchill and Chaim Weizmann, in which Churchill urged Britain to live up to its promises and open up the gates to Palestine and allow the entry of the few remaining Jews, the refugees from Europe, the people who are now in DP camps. Churchill sort of put that off, saying it would have to be discussed at a future European peace conference. Of course, that peace conference was never held. And this was greatly disappointing to Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, because they were hoping that at the end of the war, the suffering of the Jewish people would be recognized. Ironically, just a month after that last correspondence between Churchill and Weizmann, Churchill lost office in the British election of July 1945. He wasn't to return to power until October 1951. The Labour government under Clement Attlee as Prime Minister and Ernest Bevin as Foreign Secretary came to power for the next 6 years. It was decidedly unsympathetic to the idea of a partition and the creation of a Jewish state. Bevin himself, in some people's minds, was anti-Semitic, which is a matter of argument. And Churchill, the British government didn't recognize the state of Israel until some months after most other countries had. Churchill spoke up against the Labour government policy. And then after Israel became independent and Churchill returned to power, he resumed a warm relationship with Chaim Weizmann until Weizmann died in 1952, and then with Ben-Gurion as his successor. And Churchill and Ben-Gurion actually met once in 1961, which is a story we can tell on another occasion.
It is amazing to me how much, well, you've covered a span of probably 60 years in 45 minutes, and yet have been able to do it with great depth and interest, and we thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Matthew Sackle, so that he can offer some of the questions that our audience has been waiting to ask you. But thank you so, so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Sackle. I'm the Associate Manager of Education at the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and I'm delighted to thank Lee for this great session. I'm going to open it up to some questions that we have here, but before I take the questions, I just want to make a few quick announcements. There are a few events coming up. There's a book and author on Tuesday, June 16th at 5 p.m., Embrace the Possible. Our Pride program on June 23rd at 6:30, LGBTQ Jewish Upstanders with Eric Marcus, and I will be moderating that program. And finally, we'll be sending a link to our events page in the chat box, and we'll be sending out a survey in the chat box. So please be watching for that. So right now, I'm going to put a couple of questions to you that have been asked. Neil and Fran asked basically the same question. Can you address the reports of Jan Karski, who met with British government officials in '42 and informed them of what was going on? And why wasn't there a more profound reaction?
Well, Jan Karski was a Polish Christian political figure who had prepared a detailed report about Auschwitz. And as I remember, he was able to get both to London and to Washington in 1943. I forget if he met with Churchill or not, but I know that he met with, actually met with Franklin Roosevelt and many other people in Washington to report on what was happening. Again, he didn't have the full details that became apparent as time passed. And it's the same question. In the fog of war, why was this not a top priority for the British and American governments? And as I've commented on, it's a combination of things. Karski met with Justice Felix Frankfurter at that same time in Washington in 1943. And Frankfurter later said, I told him I didn't believe him. I didn't think he was lying, but I couldn't believe him. So to appreciate the enormity of what was happening at places like the Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz, sort of defied imagination for many people. And as I said, it was part of a broader time of horrible things happening. One of the ironies that I think is notable is that when the Nazis destroyed the village of Phylicia in Czechoslovakia, murdered 200 people, took away their children, this was a reprisal for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the Reich protector of Czechoslovakia. That made worldwide headlines, and the Nazis were condemned and criticized for it. And that was a tragic event. The death of 6 million Jews was it a more tragic event because it was so many times larger? That it's a difficult question. There isn't really a good answer other than, if the world knew then what it knew today, and that if the singularity of the Holocaust, even in the middle of the Second World War, had been recognized and defined the way it is today, the world might have reacted differently. But it's a complicated question, and it applies both to the United States and the Roosevelt administration as much or more as it does to Churchill.
Phylicia asks, as a strong supporter of the Jews, why did the UK attempt to stop Jewish refugees from entering the UK?
Mostly for domestic political reasons, and the same applies to the United States. The British, at least to their credit, allowed 10,000 Jewish children from Germany and Austria to enter in the Kinder transport in 1938 and 1939. There was a bill in the United States at the same time, the Nurse Rogers bill in Congress, to do the same thing, which was rejected. It was the same story, a combination of anti-Semitism, a desire not to allow in immigrants who might become a burden on the population. It was a time of high unemployment still in both countries, and just a lack of sympathy for the plight of the Jews of Europe. And the attitudes were similar in both the United States and in Britain, unfortunately. Yeah,
and also taking into account the many thousands of children that were brought in with Kinder transport. So there was that positive aspect. Could you comment on Churchill's belief in eugenics?
Yes, Churchill, I would say, flirted with eugenics in the 1920s. It wasn't a cause of his, and I would put it in context. Eugenics was a widely accepted, widely popularly held belief in both America and in Britain in the 1920s. we know it today to be reprehensible. It wasn't regarded as that. The United States was actually, far further down the scale of eugenic experiments, if you want to call them that. But Churchill, for a brief period of time, thought that the quality of what he called the British race could be improved if people who were mentally retarded were not allowed to reproduce. That's a disdainful, disgusting attitude today, but it was widely debated and widely popular at the time. So there's no excuse or explanation for it other than the context of
Great.
context of
Brian
history.
asks, did Churchill ever indicate remorse for not taking more forceful action against the concentration camps?
I don't recall that there was a specific expression of that. What's notable is that when he wrote his history of the Second World War, 6 volumes that came out between 1948 and 1953, and won him the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, the focus of that narrative was military political history, obviously a lot to justify Churchill's own role in those great events. There's almost no mention of the Holocaust in that 6 volumes. So it isn't something where Churchill, remember he was, by the mid-1950s, he was over 80 years old and retired in 1955. And I would put that in the context of the world, even Americans or American Jews in the 1940s and 50s, didn't recognize the historical uniqueness of the Holocaust and what had happened and what wasn't done. The first major study of the Holocaust by Raoul Hilberg didn't come out until the early 1960s. And in the 1940s and 50s, Holocaust survivors, as we know, in many cases didn't want to talk about what had happened to them. So there was a collective amnesia in the world for the first 10 or 15 years after 1945, and that's obviously changed totally in the decades since then. So the short answer is it wasn't something that Churchill, he didn't have a sense of atonement about it.
The next question is going to fast forward us to today. In the past couple of weeks, as the Black Lives Matter movement has again come to the forefront, Churchill has received criticism, and Alex wonders, what can you tell us about some of his possibly racist views that have come to the surface?
Well, Churchill had views on race that don't comport with our views today. They were not untypical of his age and time. Churchill's views become better known because he is such a famous person and he wrote so much and spoke so much. Was Churchill a racist? That was what was painted on his statue across from the House of Commons a couple of days ago. I would say this, he wasn't a racist in the sense of believing that people were biologically determined to be of different abilities based on their skin color, but he had what you would call a white supremacist view. He thought that the white Christian civilizations of Europe and North America, especially the English-speaking ones, had contributed more to the goodness of the world than any other peoples. And he justified imperialism on that basis longer than most people did. And that's an aspect of his personality and character that we have to recognize and deal with. He wasn't forward-thinking. He didn't think and speak the way people do today. And you can say that about Lincoln. You can say that about Franklin Roosevelt and lots of other people. Whether that should be expressed in the form of knocking down his statue or painting it over, things like that, is another question.
Thank you. This is a bit more lighthearted. Is it true that Winston Churchill hated the portrait that Parliament presented to him upon his retirement and that he burned it?
Yes, that actually is a true story. If you saw the Crown TV series, that's an episode that's played up there. It was a gift of Parliament for his 80th birthday, and Churchill sat for the painting by Graham Sutherland and actually got along with the artist very well. But when he saw a preview of the finished portrait a couple of weeks before it was supposed to be unveiled, he was aghast. He said it made me look like a mean and malicious old man. And it is a candid portrait of someone who was an old man at the time. And he said, I don't want this. And he was told, you have to go through with this because the ceremony is set and this is what Parliament is giving you. And you can find a video clip today of the ceremony when the portrait's unveiled and there's a sort of gasp of silence because it's not what the audience is anticipating. And Churchill lightens it up by saying, this portrait is a remarkable example of modern art. So he takes it home, sticks it in the basement, and then sometime afterwards, his wife, Clementine, in the dark of night, takes it out to the garden and burns it. I actually don't think it's such an insulting or ugly likeness. Was that artistic vandalism, you could say, or was it the right of the family to do with it as they chose because it was a present that had been given to them?
Okay, to be respectful of time, it's fine if some of you need to head out. Lee has graciously agreed to stay for a few more questions if we have any more questions.
Matthew, could I mention the one diary story that
please do.
So I think this is something, then we go back to some other questions. There's one story about Churchill that I do like to relate, and it's something we just came across not too long ago. It's about a young girl who was living in occupied Europe with her family. Her family listened to the radio extensively for news of the world outside the Nazi realm. This teenage girl kept a diary, and she found this endless radio rather annoying. She wrote at one point, quote, "The radio goes early in the morning until 9, 10, and 11 o'clock in the evening." She continued, "Ugh, it gets so boring, and it's quite a job not to become a dull old stick myself." But then she added, "I must mention one shining exception. A speech by our beloved Winston Churchill is quite perfect." So I would say, despite Churchill's many faults and mistakes, his words and his voice did bring hope to the people of occupied Europe suffering under the Nazi yoke. If the girl writing that diary were alive today, today would be her 91st birthday. She didn't live to the age of 16. It was, of course, Anne Frank.
Thank you for that. We have just a couple more questions. One question asks, what does the book The Volunteer by Jack Fairweather tell us about Churchill and the Jews that perhaps we didn't know before?
Well, I have to confess, I don't know that book, so I'm going to have to look it up and respond. It's not a book I'm familiar with, unfortunately.
Thank you. One more question. Do you think that did Israel factor in as an issue in the British election of 1951? And can Churchill's election be seen in any way as reflective of his opinion towards Israel and a greater population?
I don't think that was a factor in that election particularly. The Labour government had been in power for 6 years. The British people were tired. They were still under rationing. Some of the expectations in 1945 of what the Labour government would do were not realized. Labour actually got a couple 100,000 votes more than the Conservatives, but Churchill won a narrow majority of seats. But that I don't think the issue of what had happened to the Jews or Israel was a significant factor in that election.
Fantastic. I think that, let's see. And someone asks, where would you rank the Roosevelts as leaders in the 20th century?
I think Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill together are two of the iconic leaders of the 20th century and are certainly recognized as that. Each had their faults in a lot of ways, but their partnership and friendship, which is something I talk about on other occasions, was unique in creating an alliance that defeated the twin threats of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Roosevelt, in addition, was a great peacetime leader in the years from 1933 to 1941. So they're iconic figures. They have their faults, failings, misgivings. You can be more admiring of one and less of the other, or vice versa, or less admiring of both of them. But they're unique figures in history, and the times in which they lived and led are unique in the world, and God willing, even with our current troubles, those kind of times won't be repeated again.
And one final question was from Lee, is that there was a story that Winston Churchill told Lord Carrington at a weekend getaway after the death of Queen Victoria. I'm curious if the King's ascension will entirely revolutionize his way of life, or will he sell his horses and scatter his Jews?
Yes. Victoria died in 1901 when Churchill was a young man, and Edward, who became Edward VII, her son, the Prince of Wales, had a number of Jewish friends, Sir Ernest Cassell being one of them. Again, that was, frowned upon in British aristocratic society. Most of the British establishment did not have Jewish friends, and that's why Lord Randolph was unusual. And the Prince of Wales could have any friends he wanted to have. So hence that reference. When he becomes king, will he disassociate himself with some of the Jewish, financiers and business and social people he knew? And as I recall, he didn't actually. Edward VII, as he became, turned out to be a good king, even though he had to wait until he was over 60 to ascend to the throne. And that was the context of that reference.
Yes. Well, Lee, many thanks for this terrific
Thank
session.
you.
And I'd like to thank everyone who attended today's program. You'll notice there's a link to our survey down in the chat. If you could take a moment to fill that survey out, that would be appreciated. It helps us shape our programming that we bring to you. And thank you very much. I look forward to seeing all of you. We have another program coming up at June 15th. June 16th at 5:00 p.m. The Choice, Embrace the Possible, a conversation with Auschwitz survivor, author, Dr. Edith Eva Edgar. You can sign up at ilholocaustmuseum.org/events. And on June 23rd at 6:30 p.m., LBGTQ, Jewish Upstanders with Eric Marcus, moderated by me. And I would love to see all of you there. Again, thank you very much for attending this program, and we will see you all very soon. I hope you all have a terrific weekend. Bye-bye.